You're listening to episode 122 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Zen teacher Lee Carlson speaks to us about being a traumatic brain injury survivor, the healing companionship of dogs, and his new book, Passage to Nirvana. We are surprisingly resilient and yet oddly fragile beings. We break, we get injured, and we heal. Sometimes those injuries are not visible wounds, but the effects are life-changing. It's a traumatic life event, as can be the case with brain injury. Who we are, how we identify with our self, if I can use that word on a Buddhist podcast, is so very much dependent on this substrate of the brain. And when that physical part of our bodies is damaged, our healing process is that much more challenging. Lee Carlson has been a journalist for 25 years, has been editor-in-chief of a low-temperature physics magazine and a computer magazine, as well as a senior travel editor at Skiing Magazine. His freelance credits include NBC Sports, ESPN, Outside Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, and many other media outlets. He is a traumatic brain injury survivor, and Passage to Nirvana is his first book. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Nantucket nectar flavor of your choice. And everyone, our guest today is Lee Carlson. Lee, thank you very much for being here.
Hi, Ted. It's great to be here.
And we're going to be talking about your book, Passage to Nirvana. But this book is really about your story. So when I asked the question to tell us about your background, of course, start with when you were younger and all of that, but really tell your story, because that's what we're here to find out about.
Sure. So since this is a Buddhist program as well, my story probably goes back to, when I was in college, and I took a comparative religions course. I was raised a Christian. I'm a Presbyterian. And I took a class, and I was really fortunate that I had a teacher who was very forward-thinking, and my school was in New York in the Catskills, and he took us on an extra credit trip for a weekend to a Tibetan monastery, anybody that wanted to go. And so it wasn't just this classroom study. I suddenly was exposed to this wonderful monastery and this wonderful world, and it just kind of blew me away. And I was also very fortunate. I have a cousin. I sometimes call her my aunt because she's my mother's first cousin, and we're very close. And her name, some people may know, is Joanna Macy. And Joanna came to to a family function once about the same time. She didn't live. I think she was living at the time on the West Coast or something. And she just had this sparkle in her eyes. She just had this amazing presence. And I said, I don't know what she has, but whatever she has, I want it. And what she had is that her husband had been, I believe, like second or third in command of the Peace Corps in India about the time that the Dalai Lama and all the other lamas were run out by the Chinese. And so she had no knowledge of Buddhism whatsoever, but she and her husband were people that were very much helping other people. And so she went up to Dharamsala to help the refugees, and that was her beginning, and that started her down the path, and she started studying, and so her path is more Tibetan. But so those two things really started me down the Buddhist path. which is now, I hate to admit it, probably 35 years ago or almost 35 years ago.
Time flies, isn't it?
Yes, it does. And since then, I've done a lot of like most Americans. I'm kind of a Buddhist mutt. I've had many teachers. I've had Tibetan teachers. I've had Sri Lankan teachers. I've had American teachers. I've had teachers who come from a Japanese Zen lineage. I've had teachers who come from a Vietnamese Zen lineage. My own personal lineage that I settled into more than anything else is Zen, and both my Vietnamese and Japanese lineage teachers are the ones that I've spent the most time with. So I kind of feel close to the secular Buddhism end of things because of all the traditions. I think Zen comes closest to paring away and getting rid of all the trappings and trying to get to the bottom of things. So that was how I started a long time ago. And then it'll be 10 years ago, actually, in about a month, I guess, will be the anniversary of my accident. I was in a car accident. I was actually run over by a car at a car wash, of all places. It was kind of odd. I've done all these crazy things in my life, and where do I finally get injured? I get hit in a car wash. And I suffered a traumatic brain injury. I woke up in the hospital a couple days later, and um, it was in Long Island, New York. And when I got out of the hospital, they said, "Where are you going to go?" And they sent me down to Florida, where my father lived, to go to rehab. And the unfortunate part of it is that one of the reasons they sent me to Florida is that my mother had had a very, very serious traumatic brain injury about 9 months before. She'd fallen down a flight of stairs and hit her head on the basement concrete floor and had to have part of her brain removed, and she was a mess. And I had been involved in her caregiving up until then, and then my parents had a house in Florida. That's where they lived, and so I had helped my father when they let her out of the hospital and into a nursing home, and then they took her out of the nursing home and flew her to Florida, and we helped. Anyway, so my father unfortunately already had teams of neurologists and therapists and everybody all in place, and it was like, okay, don't make one reservation, make two. Here he comes, and so it was really an interesting exercise in many ways because when I first got to Florida, some of the first questions for my neurologist, my neuropsychologist, were things like, well, okay, I understand that I've really injured my brain. I'm having trouble thinking, and I really was. But I said, I do this other thing that I do, which is kind of where I try and eliminate thinking, which is my meditation practice. And is that okay? I thought they were going to tell me, oh, you can't do that. You're trying to regain your thinking, not, and they both, and fortunately they were up on all the latest literature and they knew all the research and they all said, oh, no, that's great. That's wonderful. And not only, should you do it, but we encourage you to do it. And we also encourage you to get into a restorative yoga program because I had other parts of my body that were injured, and they were really very supportive and it was great. And actually, as you well know, one of my therapists was Earl Rectanis, who has been a guest on your show and who's a regular on your website, I guess. And Earl was very helpful, and he and I hit it off in many ways. And so it was really an interesting thing. And my neurologist said to me, he said, you're going to be really lucky. He said, you're going to be sort of like a spiritual Buddhist Stevie Wonder, in the same way that you've lost some of your faculties to think, you've also are going to make up for it in other ways. And so, and he was right. I really was, it enhanced in many ways my spiritual awareness and my spiritual side. And that was really what started me down the path. And then because of that, I ended up writing a book called Passage to Nirvana, which is all about using many things. It's about using family and friends and community, but a lot of it is about using Buddhism and Zen and meditation and yoga to find happiness after a traumatic life event. And I purposely say to find happiness after a traumatic life event and not after a traumatic brain injury because I wanted it to be more wide-ranging. I didn't want it to just be about brain injury. I wanted it to be about any traumatic life event anyone goes through, whether it's a disease or an illness or an accident or the loss of a loved one. And because in my case, in the midst of all this, my mother ended up dying from her injuries, and that was very traumatic, both being her caregiver and seeing her waste away and having her die. And in the midst of all that, I also went through a divorce, which was not necessarily caused by the brain injury, but the brain injury didn't help. And so there was a lot of trauma going on.
Yeah, you
And
had a lot of things going on at the same time, and that in itself just it makes it exponentially more challenging to deal with, and your practice must have helped that tremendously.
Absolutely. It was a lifesaver. It really was. I don't know what I would have done without it. And I'm sure that, other things helped, but I think of anything that was it. And I come from a fairly conservative family and a fairly conservative background. And I remember at one point my aunt saying to my father, what is this Zen thing that Lee's doing? It's like a cult, what is this? This is my 80-year-old aunt. And my father, who's fairly conservative, recognized it. He could even see it. He said, "No," he said, "This is giving Lee a lot of peace, and so whatever it is, it's really helping him, and let's not question it." So that was a good part of the story too.
So one of the things I'd like you to talk about is with the publication of the book, you would have had, I imagine, over the time since its publication, interactions with people who have read it, who have shared their stories, and we'll get to your next project. I want you to talk about that soon, not quite yet.
Sure.
But if you could tell us a little bit about some of the most rewarding things that you've heard from the first book in what you had shared by putting out there and what you've heard from readers of the book.
Oh, there's so many rewarding things. It's hard to know where to start. But the most rewarding things are the emails that I'm getting from all over the world. And that was one of the really fascinating things, which the the internet really facilitates, and Facebook is my second largest readership after the US is Indonesia. The second largest city is Jakarta after New York City, of where I have fans and readers. And I get, the great thing is that the most of the emails I get, sure, I get the ones that say, you've really helped me understand my brother that has a traumatic brain injury. You've helped me cope with my sister that who had a really bad stroke and has, a lot of brain damage. And that's great, and those are wonderful too. But I suppose the most rewarding ones are the ones that I get from people that I would have never expected in all walks of life, who thank me in many ways, and they always say thank you. That's what I love, that part of the email. They always say thank you for writing the book, and then they tell me, why and what way, and there are many different ways. I got one email from a Franciscan friar who told me that it really helped him understand one of his fellow monks. I got another one from a woman that's just a housewife with kids. Not just, I shouldn't say just, that's not fair to housewives, but very different walks of life. And some of them understand and are thankful for the Buddhist part. And that's also been really amazing to me, is that having been doing this for 30 years, I've seen a big shift, and I still always think like, oh boy, am I going to be looked upon as this nutcase? And then, I think I get emails from people that you just wouldn't think about that are very conservative, who and people who are Christians, like the friar. You might think, well, he's going to stick to his Christian ideals, which he does, which is good. But it's I guess the most gratifying part is just how universal the message is and how many people recognize that.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's one of the things that this podcast and the effort around secular Buddhism is about. It's not a rejection of tradition or saying that no, that's wrong. That's fine for people to do it. Many of us who are consider ourselves secular Buddhists come from traditional backgrounds, as you yourself do. It's that this is opening the doors to people who may not otherwise engage with it. So we are finding folks who are secular humanists who are taking on a meditative practice that comes from Buddhist tradition, or atheists. We have many people on the Facebook who have that red letter A of atheism for their icon, and Christians and Jews. And I participate in interfaith dialogue, so that universality of the practice, to me, is one of the many key indicators that this is just more evidence for how valid it is that it's cross-cultural, cross-belief, cross-tradition. Tell us a little bit more about that perspective you have as someone who's been doing this for a long time, and how that may have changed from 30 years ago. Talking about
Sure.
meditation might not have been as well received as it is today.
Well, I think things like, the story I just told about my aunt. Example, when my mother died, so this is now 9 years ago, and she was a real force in her community. When they had the service for her, there were about 700 people in the church, and she had been very active in volunteer work and very active in her community, and or people from all walks of life. And it was a Presbyterian church. And I said to the minister, I said, I'm going to do her eulogy. And as part of the eulogy, I'm going to do something a little different. I hope it's okay with you, but I'm going to, at the end of the eulogy, invite everybody to help my mother transfer out of the Bardo, which was really, this was one of those karma things because I didn't realize her service ended up being scheduled exactly, oh, I can't remember how many days it is right now, but in Tibetan belief. And it was pointed out to me by my aunt, Joanna Macy, that that was happening and that that day of her service was the day the Tibetans would believe is the day that the soul
Yeah,
leaves the
it's after a
bardo and
set
goes on
number of days that's the
after a
right
set
time.
number
Yeah.
of days. And so I asked all 700 people in the church to join me in a moment of meditative silence to help wish my mother, well on her spiritual journey. And the minister thought that was great. He was like, "Wow, that's great. That's fantastic." And then he also told me that, "Oh, by the way, we have a Zen sitting group that we host in our basement once a week." And this was a church that I had grown up in Buffalo, New York. That when I had grown up in it, it was very conservative. And so I did it, not knowing what sort of reaction I would get. And afterwards, I can't tell you how many people came up to me, really, my mother's generation, older conservative people who came up to me and said how wonderful that part of the service was, and they thanked me for that. So I think people are open to the message if it's presented in a positive manner, and they don't look at it as being so weird as they might have 30 years ago. Me standing up in the front of a giant Presbyterian church talking about, Tibetan Buddhist beliefs was I'm like, okay, what are people going to, what am I going to get, what kind of feedback am I going to get from this? But it was great. So.
It's interesting that they had this Zen practice going on in the church that you had known for so long. It's like we discovered life on Mars, and then the guy next to you on the bus says, "Well, I'm Martian." Right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
That.
And I love that. That was really wonderful. And I think the other universality of my book, which I find really interesting, is my book, I purposely modeled it on the Four Noble Truths. And those of you out there who know the Four Noble Truths, which is the truth of suffering, is sort of the first one, and then the end is that there is a path out of suffering. And so, you go through a traumatic life event, you suffer. And in my case, as you noted, there were many of them at once. And especially as we get older, we all go through this. But not as we get older. I mean, my brother-in-law died of cancer at an early age. His kids were only, I don't know how old they were, probably 10 and 8 at the time or something. And so, even younger people go through that. And I have another relative that at the age of 18 had a real drug problem that was very traumatic. We all know that people like this. So that message, the universality of that message as well, which was, if you know the story of the Buddha, when he came down from Vulture Peak, the very first talk that he gave was the talk on the Four Noble Truths, because he believed that that was the most important thing he had learned. And so my book, in a very subtle way, without telling people that, without ramming it down their throats, it mirrors that teaching. And so I find that people really relate to that, even if they don't know anything about Buddhism and the Four Noble Truths, they relate to the truth of suffering.
Yeah, yeah, and the Dhammataka Sutta, the very first one that he relays to those first few disciples who were his compadres, who were originally going to blow him off because he dared to eat some rice. Oh, he's gone back to those hedonistic practices of eating solid food, and just couldn't not listen to that because of I think the message from that their inability wasn't so much as it's related in the Pali of, oh, he has this, wonderful manner about him and all that, and they just couldn't resist. It's the universality of the message. It's something that could not be ignored. And that's what you have in this, is that universality of, we all at some point in our lives encounter this idea of suffering, even if we have the most wonderful life and people are happy. Things change, shit happens.
Exactly.
And it's going to, and how do we deal with it?
How do we deal with it?
So in the book, you talk about the Four Noble Truths, and then, of course, the fourth being the Eightfold Path. How in depth do you go into that in the book, and ways people apply that in their lives?
I don't really go into it in depth in that way. I felt that my gifts as a storyteller were best used to tell my story and to use it as a sort of Aesop's fable kind of story, and that the lessons were more in the story and could be gleaned from it as opposed to, and there are so many good books. There's so many really wonderful books out there that are more expository writing about the Eightfold Path and right speech and right action, that sort of thing, that I didn't really think that was the direction that I wanted my book to take. And also, I didn't want my book to be a purely Buddhist book. I also feel that one of my gifts is that since I do have a diverse background, and that I can reach people like those 700 people in the Presbyterian Church, that they will trust me, listen to me, and learn. They're not the kind of people that would sit down and read a treatise on the Eightfold Path or the
Right.
Four Noble Truths, but they can learn the general ideas. And so there there are stories, and the way the book is organized, it's a lot of very, very short stories. Some of the chapters are literally only a paragraph long, and each one, and then some chapters are 6 or 10 pages long. So, but each one is organized around a theme or an idea, and some of those ideas are things like right action and right livelihood and right speech, but it doesn't say that. It just kind of implies that.
Yeah, it goes into them for an audience who will be receptive to it in the way it's presented, and that was one of the wonderful ways in which the Buddha engaged with people was, who's my audience? Let me engage with the level at which is going to be most effective with them. And that's what you've replicated in the book.
And he told stories. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
my favorite part, are all the wonderful stories with the wonderful animal
yeah, yeah,
stories, and the
yeah.
stories of the woman with the dead baby with he told her to go find a grain of rice. I mean, those are stories, and the lessons are within the story. They're not expository. I mean, he did give expository talks as well, but anyway, that was the path that I decided to take with the book. So.
And that's in some ways, a very riveting manner for people to engage with the message you're trying to get across, is that you compare telling a story that has a theme with which we can all resonate and all immediately understand what it's about versus, say, a 3-hour lecture on Thursday nights in college. Not that I'm referring to anything in particular, Dr. Greenfield, but those are a lot more challenging, even when you're a great lecturer, than the story. And where we frequently, as folks who have, say, a secular approach, is that we don't really seem to have an appreciation for story, that we want to reject the stories of our traditions. And no, that's not it. We do found great, great value in those stories, and they inform our practice and our daily lives. And it's that we can also find stories here today that also resonate with an audience that isn't from a culture of 2,500 years ago.
Absolutely. And man has always learned through storytelling and will always continue to do so. And, whether it's, I hesitate to say it, on television, or whether it's in the movies, or whether it's in a book, or whether it's at the theater, or whatever it is, it's just, that's the way we learn best in a lot of ways. So, and that's my background. I'd been a writer. I didn't just write this book. There are a lot of books out there, which are great books, but that are written by people who aren't necessarily writers. I had been a writer for 25 years. That's my profession. I'd started out in journalism, and I worked in sports journalism. I worked in business journalism. Then I switched over to doing more commercial work because I had a family to raise and I needed the money to do things like copywriting. And then, so this was my first book, but that's what I do. I'm a writer and a storyteller. So.
Yeah. Now, you you had a co-author on this, and you credit this person on your web. And the reason I'm going to bring this up and ask you to tell one of your favorite stories about your co-author is, I just spent time at this particular kind of person's park. Mm-hmm. One of my roommates and my boy really enjoys that. So tell us about Henry.
Henry is a golden retriever. He will be 13 in August. He's just starting to slow down a little bit, but he still has got just such a wonderful disposition. And he was my therapy dog through all of this. He's been by my side. And to me, one of the real roots of Buddhism is unconditional love. It really is. And whether you call it metta, whether you call it unconditional love, whether you call it, compassion is slightly different, but it's still the same thing. Anyway, he doesn't judge me. He doesn't. Okay, every once in a while he gets mad if I don't take him for a walk as fast as he wants, so bark at me. But he just has such a wonderful personality, and also the great thing about him is that he's calm sometimes, but heck, sometimes he is not calm. He jumps, he whatever.
He's a golden. They do.
He's a golden, right? And that's part of Buddhism too. In Zen we call it the stink of Zen, which is that um, you get too involved with the meditative aspect and the calm aspect, and you forget that that's just one part of life, and that life, sometimes people bark and jump around, and sometimes they're very calm. And so for all those reasons, he has been a wonderful teacher. And as a writing partner, he literally sits there at my feet next to me while I'm on the computer, and when I've been on there too long, he just gets up and he nudges my elbows and knocks my fingers off the keyboard and goes, "Okay, time for a break. I want to go for a walk." And I say, "You know what? You're right. I'm sitting here getting nothing done because I've already, used up what I can use up, and I need a break. I need to clear my head." And so he's been a wonderful teacher, companion, writing companion, editor in many, many ways. And he has his own chapter in the book, which I thought he deserved. So it's, he's a good guy.
Excellent. And he's like a biological mindfulness timer.
It's
a reminder to be mindful.
Absolutely. And he is. I mean, that's it. He's like, he's not thinking about something else. He's just in the moment. He's very much, moment by moment, breath by breath. That's where he is. And he keeps me there sometimes too. So.
And I thought of this for two reasons. One is that you do have Henry on a video that you have on your website. So folks if you dog people, go there. You'll see Henry. Henry is wonderful. And I had just to mention to you that I'd had a wonderful evening of tea and conversation with Dr. Eric Storley, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, and got to meet his golden, who's about the same age as Henry, and is also pictured a couple of times with him, and has that same, of course, place in Eric's heart as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure. And he's great in a few other ways too. He, now that he's getting old, I'm his caregiver, and he's definitely slowing down. And I've already talked to him about it and said, as you get older, I'm going to take care of you. And I took care of him when he was younger. I adopted him when he was 9 months old. I didn't just get him as a puppy. He was adopted because he had issues. And so, we have an understanding. We take care of each other. So
excellent. Now, you also have another project that you're starting up that is a follow-up to Passage to Nirvana, and I believe that is called Voices of Nirvana. Is that correct?
That's right.
Tell us about that, because people want to hear about what you're doing next.
Sure. I get so many emails from people thanking me for writing the book, but also telling me their stories. And I've gotten so many great stories from around the world. And I just thought, you know what? Maybe that should be the next book. And the hard part about writing a memoir, which is basically what Passage to Nirvana was, is that there's a lot of I in there. That's a lot about me. And I have spent 30 plus years getting rid of ego, reaching non-self, as we call it. And for me to sit there writing a book about me was like, oh my goodness, I can't do this. And it was hard. And actually my Roshi, and some of your readers may know this particular person, is a man named Peter Matheson, who's a very well-known writer. He wrote The Snow Leopard and won a National Book Award for it, which is all about his spiritual search in the Himalayas. And he was very helpful. He read a couple drafts, and at one point he said to me, "Lee, you have to put more of yourself in this book. You just have to go deeper." And I was like, "Well, okay, fine." So the next book, I really wanted to take myself out of it and really tell other people's stories. And as a former journalist, I think I'm pretty good at that, because that's a lot of what I did when I interviewed people and wrote about them. And I just thought it was a way to use my skills and also to help people, because I know it can be very healing if you've had a trauma in your life to write, whether it's just writing in a journal or in my case, taking it all the way to writing a book. And so I thought it would be very helpful both to the people whose stories that I used. I thought it would be very helpful to readers, and I thought it would be a learning process for me as well. And I thought for all those reasons it would be really great. And my plan is to make it very similar to Passage to Nirvana, in that there are these very short, pithy chapters, but each chapter might have a little preface or maybe an afterword by me about what aspect of practice this relates to. And it's not necessarily Buddhist practice. It might just be something as simple as perseverance, or how somebody really got through what they got through is basically it, and how they ended up reaching nirvana on the other side. So that's my idea. It's a huge undertaking, and I will tell you, it's going to happen one way or another. I'm not giving up on it. I have been raising money through Kickstarter.com, and I'm not sure when this podcast will be available, but there are only about 48 hours left to raise the rest of the funds on Kickstarter. So we'll see what happens. And if I don't reach my goal, I'll just do it a different way. But if I do it, then I can do the whole book all at once. If I don't raise it, I may do it as a blog posting and do a story at a time until I have enough. But I definitely want to do it. I think it's a great project, and I think it's a good project from a way to help other people. It's a great project from a Buddhist standpoint. I like it, and I think once people, it's hard as a writer to sometimes tell people what a project is going to be, because they don't see what you see in your mind, but I know I see it, and I just know it's going to be great. So
yeah. And for folks who are listening to the podcast, it'll be a few weeks before this comes out, but I will have information about the website. So if you're interested in finding out more about what Lee is doing, there's one more thing I want to go into before I talk about his website and where to go and we sign off. And that is that, Lee, you also do a live radio show. Tell us about that.
Sure. I do a show. It's called Brain Injury Radio, and I actually am a guest host once a month. The show is on every Monday night at 10 o'clock Eastern time, and we have different hosts. I'm the host on the fourth Monday of every month. And it's a lot of work, as you well know from doing your show, lining up guests and preparing for it. The difference is it's live, so that makes it even
more interesting.
Yeah, and more traumatic at times. It's like, what's happening? And I usually have guests on, but I do try, since there are other guest hosts and everybody has their own thing, my guests are usually somewhat of a spiritual Buddhist. I just had some women on that do a yoga program for traumatic brain injured vets. So it's a show that explores my interests, and it is very for people, and it's great. It's I get wonderful comments from people all over the world. Again, and we get people calling in from all over the world thanks to Skype. We have apparently a big listenership in Europe, and to me, it's right livelihood, it's right action, although it's not right livelihood because I don't get paid for it, but it's it's just another way of following the ideals of the Buddhist ideals of compassion. And I want to talk, before we sign off, I want to talk about what you do, because I have become more aware of secular Buddhism thanks to you and thanks to Earl, and I've been reading your mission statement and what you do, and I think it's great. I really am very much in tune with what you guys are doing, because I too, the nature of my book, as you've seen, is not, it's a Zen book, but it's not a Zen book. It's not about the trappings of Zen. It's really about the core teachings of Buddhism, teachings of compassion, of the Four Noble Truths, of the Eightfold Path, those sort of things. So, and my radio show is the same way. I mean, I don't go on the radio show and say, hey, I'm a Zen Buddhist. I go on the radio show and say, hey, I'm a traumatic brain injury survivor. But everybody knows that the kind of guests that I have on and the way that I direct the conversations is very much what I'm interested in issues of compassion. And I got a great email just a couple days ago, actually, from a woman. It's such a funny story. She had sent me an email saying, I really want to listen to your show, but I can't listen live. I'd love to call in some night, but I can't call in. I can only listen to the podcast because I'm a traumatic brain injury survivor. The show's on too late at night. I can't stay up that late. So I just sent her simply on my back saying, well, I can't stay up that late either. I take a nap before the show. And, and that's because traumatic brain injury survivors, anybody that knows anything about it, one of the problems is stamina, and you oftentimes are very tired late at night. So she sent me a back saying, what a simple solution. I hadn't thought of that. That's great. I'm putting it in my calendar. I'm taking a nap every time. And my sister listened to the show, and my sister, who must be her caregiver, at least a family member, said she's never heard a more supportive community in her life, and this woman says, I agree. And I said, that's it. That's the message of a supportive community, Sangha, that's what I want to do, and that's what I do, which is great. And but the secular Buddhist part, what I want to say to your listeners too, is that I love it and it's great. I would encourage, as you say, you have a lot of atheist listeners. I would encourage you to keep the big A, but maybe just shift it a little bit, because I was an agnostic for many years when I was younger before I discovered Buddhism. And I think personally, to me, agnosticism was more interesting just because you're not certain about anything. You just have a more open mind. And to me, that's something that I personally think is better, in the same way that I wouldn't go all the way to one end of being atheist. I don't necessarily go all the other end in Buddhism either. I think that sort of middle way. And I also think I know what you're saying about critical thinking. There's so many things in Buddhism where people just blindly follow and get way into the mysticism part. However, I wouldn't totally dismiss the mysticism part. Part of my accident and part of the book is that I did have some pretty amazing, my neurologist was right. I had some pretty amazing experiences after the accident and after I was meditating quite regularly. And to me, what are so-called mystical experiences have been anything but mystical. They have been the most concrete, real experiences that I have ever had. And I've done peyote, I've done mushrooms, I've done,
psilocybin studies.
Yeah. I mean, I'm like many people in our age group and demographic, and that I was a real seeker, and trust me, I saw it in every single.
You saw it well and often.
Yeah, and the so-called mystical experiences are, as I say, they are probably the most real concrete experiences I've ever had. So, as in all things in Buddhism, it's finding that balance. Don't go too far one way. Don't go too far the other way. Find the balance between the, for lack of a better word, the left brain, the right brain. Find the balance between the critical thinking and the feeling, the non-critical thinking, the intuition. And to me, that is the core essence of Buddhism.
Yeah, and as we were talking earlier, a lot of the experiences that we have are very compelling. They help us look at things in new ways, and they can be very transformative to how we approach life, whether it's a psilocybin trip that you're on under, say, controlled conditions like they're doing in the labs now, bring that back, or whether it's a traumatic brain injury, or whether it's an experience that one has in meditation. All of these can help us look at things in new ways, can change our perspective, and really that's the point. So regardless of the veracity of what our conclusions are about these, they can still help us. And that's one of the most important things to get out of this, that yes, we can apply critical thinking. Let's apply it in, is this working for me? Is this helping me? Is this informing my practice? Is it making me engage better with people and feel better about moment-by-moment suffering that I'm running into? It's interesting that you brought up the kind of the shared mission that we have here is bringing this practice to people who might otherwise engage with it. As I was mentioning, I was just at the 10th annual scientific conference in Massachusetts, and it was primarily MBSR type studies. And that was one of the things that kept getting mentioned again and again, is that MBSR is primarily, and it has been rooted in, a therapeutic setting. And one of the things that they've been mentioning is, we really want to bring this practice to a wider audience who's not otherwise finding it. And that's what you're doing with this kind of work, with your show and with the book and with the new book that you're going to be putting together, is how do we deal with suffering moment by moment? What have others done? And these are the stories that inspire us, and that can nudge us the extra bit we need to be able to deal with the things in our own lives. So thank you so much for doing that.
And Ted, you have just summed it up in a very succinct and wonderful way. So I'm going to write that down. I'm going to put it on my website or something. So no, it's really, you get it, which is great. So I think you're doing a wonderful job with the show and with the website and the Facebook page and, your own way of getting it out there. So
Thanks,
keep up the good work.
Appreciate it. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask about the radio show, is it available in a podcast format? Are these recorded and available later?
Yes, absolutely. They're all available in podcast format, and So it's both live, and when it's live, you can call in. You can also, there's an ongoing chat that goes along with it for people that don't want to call in. And then the whole thing it's available within, I don't know, 24 hours or something as a podcast. So.
Excellent, excellent. So for folks who are listening to this episode, I will be linking to that podcast so that you'll be able to listen to what Lee is doing on the Brain Injury Radio Show. And also, I wanted to mention the website so you can follow up and, of course, see the video of Henry, is www.passagetonirvana.com. And, of course, that will be linked on the episode page for this episode. Our guest, Lee Carlson. Lee, thank you very, very much for being here.
Thank you, Ted, for having me. It's been a wonderful discussion, and good luck again with all your work. You're doing a great job, so thank you again for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.